So I see all this stuff happening from COVID-19, and people are asking me to have all sorts of takes about it. And what's kind of interesting is that it's vindicating a lot of the things that I and a lot of other people have believed. So I guess I should be excited about it. I don't know. Having critical things being manufactured by another country, like medicine or anything else, it's just, in general, a bad idea. And that interconnectedness is a form of fragility. Now, I'm surprised it's a virus that did this. But that aside, sure, obviously, if you're importing stuff from other countries, if you have other people from other countries just waltzing to and fro, people in one country owning things in other countries, then whenever something stupid happens in one country, you're going to be affected by that. Whereas if all the countries are more sealed off from each other, in all ways, crises don't have the same sort of global impact. They're localized. But it goes further than that. Smart businesses vertically integrate, meaning that they control, as much as they can, all relevant inputs to the production of things. And the kind of Pollyanna free trade ideas that economists generally believe in are not at all practiced by businesses internally to themselves. Yes, businesses will operate in multiple countries, but they generally seek to limit trade between businesses and try to vertically integrate as much as possible. And yet countries, for some reason, are supposed to not do this? Say you're a business and your production of cars is distributed amongst like a bunch of little companies. One company makes tires, one makes suspensions, one makes the steel siding around it, and you just do the final assembly. And if you were like this, what would happen if one of your subcontractors decided to sell to another car company instead? Right? What happens if some disaster happens and they have to shut down? They have to shut down tire productions. If you make tires yourselves, you're buying tires from the part of the company that makes tires. Now, odds are you're going to be making tires better suited to the needs of your car design than the companies that just make tires, than the independent companies that just make tires. And on top of that, if you're making tires for yourselves, now you suddenly have a bunch of new capabilities. You have a rubberization industry needed to make tires. What else can you do with a rubberization facility? What other things can you make? You can now your company can branch off into other things because you know how to work with rubber. Why? Because you make your own tires. If you don't make your own tires, these opportunities don't exist. When you have industry in your own bailiwick, be it a company or a country, it may or may not be immediately more profitable than just buying it from somewhere else who can produce it more efficiently for now. But by buying from somewhere else, you're ceding capabilities, you're ceding competencies to those other companies or countries, depending on what we're talking about. Now they have a rubberization industry and you don't. Now you could say, well, that rubberization industry, doesn't make a whole lot of money making tires. Okay, what else uses rubber? Okay. And so the immediate profitability of that additional industry is kind of incidental to the long-term economic development, which follows paths, right? When the Japanese decided they wanted their own car industry, at first they raised tariffs on foreign car imports. So Japanese at first, okay, they had more expensive and lower quality cars than if they just bought from the Americans starting in 1945. The Japanese engaged in what the likes of Paul Krugman would consider irrational economic policy if the United States were to do something like it today. But as a result of doing that, developing their own car industry instead of just buying what were for now at the time in 1945 cheaper American cars in terms of cost for quality or quantity, as a result of doing this, what does Japan now have? Well, they have an automobile industry. They have rubberization, machine tools, steelworking, glassworking, leather and upholstery working, a whole nexus of capabilities as a result of building their own cars. This then helps them in, say, building skyscrapers or literally anything that uses rubber or furniture. And once the Japanese car industry was mature enough, they lowered their tariffs on US cars in exchange for the US lowering tariffs on Japanese cars, because the US are dummies. Because when you raise tariffs on something, the other countries usually counter with tariffs. Unless you're the US today, which is just retarded and allows other countries to have tariffs without reciprocal tariffs. But the Japanese, once they did this, then they were able to compete with the mature, efficient car industries of the United States. If Japan had just gone, oh, the United States has comparative advantage in making cars, we'll do something else. That whole nexus of industrial capabilities that stems from the car-making industry wouldn't have developed in Japan because Japanese car makers would not have gotten off the ground, right? They'd be having to compete with US car companies right out of the gate, which they could not do. And the truth about the United States, okay, today the average tariff is 1.6% on all goods in the US. That's the average. More tariffs on some things, less on others, but on average it's 1.6%. And there are charts that show the average tariffs on all goods, and this is mostly an audio video, but I'll show a little chart here, so in case you're listening, you might want to look at this. But this is less important because the industrial policy purpose of tariffs is to protect industries. For example, a tariff on oil doesn't make sense for most countries, and especially if you're a country like Luxembourg, it would make no sense to erect tariffs on oil. But if you look at the US tariffs on manufactured goods, they were the highest in the world from 1820 to 1931. Not for every single year, but over that whole period, no other country had higher tariffs over the whole period. That, plus the geographic isolation of the US and higher shipping costs resulting as sort of a natural trade barrier, this resulted in the US having an economy about as insular as Russia in terms of manufacturing imports until the end of World War II. Okay, and at the end of World War II, that's when the switch was pulled, when the US went to a more free trade policy. And for a time, it was radically successful because there's no one else in the world who could compete. But before that, the United States was the premier industrial power of the world, and this happened when the United States had the most protectionist economy in the world. To square that with, oh, the US developed because of free trade is just, you can't. And more than that, the United States, not only was it a big industrial economy in an absolute sense, it was one that had vertically integrated capabilities. They weren't dependent on, say, ball bearings from Mexico or precision mechanical work from Canada or anything like that. And what the US had, these weren't globally competitive industries before World War II. They're not now, really, but before World War II, they weren't globally competitive industries. Now, were they more or less efficient than, say, French steel production? Was US steel production as efficient as French steel production? Who knows? But no country back then would be so stupid as to say, oh, France is 5% more efficient at producing steel, so by the law of trade, we must no longer have the capability to produce steel and all of our related industries surrounding it. And we must now be dependent on the whims of French politics and businesses to decide if we have a reliable supply of steel. And in the future, we may have to get into bidding wars on French steel if, say, Germany or Russia starts to expand industrially, right? When you get away from these abstractions like, well, Bob is better at growing tomatoes, Bill is better at growing potatoes, they should each specialize, and blip, 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 blip. No, you need to make your own stuff. Now it's yours. Moreover, buying from your own production, even if it's less efficient, it still may be better economically for the whole country. Think about a household. Do you pay a professional to fix the fence, or do you pay your son to fix it? Your son will take longer and do a worse job for a given amount of money or resources you put into this project. But guess what? All that stuff goes into your son. It stays in the family. And what else? Your son just got a little bit better at fixing fences. So you've grown the capabilities of your family while keeping the resources needed to fix the fence within the family. And so whether or not it's better to just hire the professional, that becomes an equation, and it's an empirical question. It can't be solved theoretically. Because when a country imports something, they are destroying their own industries or potential industries that would have emerged if they committed to producing it themselves, like the Japanese with car industries. Say the US imports German kitchenware because you get better quality for the same price or quantity for the same price. The cost for quality is higher in Germany than if you produced in the US. Okay, so say Germans are 10% more efficient at producing kitchenware. Well, if you do that, you say, well, they're 10% more efficient, we'll just buy from the Germans instead of producing it ourselves. Well, now you've destroyed the US kitchenware industry, or some proportion of it that can't compete with the German kitchenware industries. So what are those people that are now out of the job, what are they going to do? Well, there's a chance they'll do nothing. And that's a reality, is that some proportion of displaced workers do not find anything to do. They're permanently unemployed. That the sunrise industries simply never come into existence for all of the people that lose their job, right? But then you have to take into account the value of the sunrise industries versus the value of the industries you lost, because they then go off and do something else. How valuable is that something else they do? You're saving 10% on the cost of kitchenware. Kitchenware is now 10% cheaper up front. Okay, now it may become more expensive as a result of your economy being crippled, but let's just, for simplicity's sake, let's say you're getting all that benefit, you're saving 10% on kitchenware. Okay, so to break even on that, the new industries that these people go to, minus the workers who simply don't find any work at all and remain permanently unemployed, that must add up to 90% of the kitchenware industry in order for this policy to be break even in the short run. Now, what usually happens is people go into other existing industries that just expand a little bit, and so wages go down because you've increased the ratio of labor to capital. So that's a tall order already. Replace 90% or so of what you've lost as a result of free trade. On top of that, you've lost capability. You've shut off that economic path. You've lost the shipping, the packaging, metalworking, polishing, ceramic making ability, and that makes it just a little bit harder for any other industry in your country or anything related to it to expand industrially in anything that uses the capabilities you lost, and anything that uses ceramic making or metal polishing. On top of that, now you're dependent on some other country for your kitchenware. And so you're tied to the political whims of the German state and German businesses, or other states, buying kitchenware from Germany, bidding up the price. Now you either have to pay more for German kitchenware or try to go back and reconstitute your kitchenware, right? So now you're playing global trade games and global politics BS. Now, I haven't done a deep dive on how often the benefits of free trade offsets the cost, right? The lower cost of the product you're getting, how much it offsets the permanent unemployment, and the lower value of the replacement of the lost industry, which is almost an axiom going to be less valuable than the lost industry. Because if it was more valuable, they would probably already be doing it. Probably, not necessarily. Capitalists aren't perfect allocators of capital, but as a rule, it's going to be less valuable. So that your kitchenware can be cheaper, right? You're doing all this, you're taking all these hits and all this economic displacement so that your kitchenware can be cheaper. But intuitively, it seems like the answer to where the cheaper imports are going to outweigh the cost of losing that entire capability intuitively it seems that that's almost never going to be the case. And this is only in the short run. That's not taking into account the cost of closed-off economic paths. You've just lost capital. Capital is relatively immobile and hard tool. And so now you have to invest in these sunrise. They're not free. They don't just pop into existence. The replacement work for these people. It then costs you to create that, right? They're not going to be doing kitchenware, so now they're sort of downgraded into, berry farming. Well, now you have to set up the berry farms, which involves, planting the trees and getting the irrigation systems set up, getting the distribution set up. You have to get you need trucks to ship everything, right? You have to set everything up for that. And that's not free. The sunrise industry is going to pop into existence, so there's a cost to that, because, we're not using this thing we already built, so all the capital that went into that is now not worth much. You can transfer some of it, but it's relatively immobile and hard-tooled, and now you have to invest in this new thing, right? So there's a cost there as well. So just as a rule of thumb, it seems super obvious to try to do what businesses do as much as they can, which is make their own stuff, to vertically integrate. To not do this, or not at least try to do this, is just moronic. Now, the case that global free trade would be better for the global economy as a whole, if not for any particular economy, because there might be winners and losers, that's at least theoretically plausible, but I'm skeptical of even that. Even the global better efficiency of free trade, because crises happen in places, and the more interconnected the global economy is, and maximal interconnectedness you would get from maximal free trade, the more interconnected it is, the more fragile it is. And that's what this COVID-19 thing is revealing. If the US had zero trade with China, which is the correct amount of trade to have with China, and was sealed off from the rest of the world like it was during its period of ascendance to the greatest industrial power in the world, while this free trade madness has been associated with its decline. If the U.S. had retained its protectionist policies, the U.S. was sealed off, none of this would matter, or at least it would matter a lot less to the extent the U.S. was independent of the world economy. And that's another way to phrase it. Economic independence. Are you going to be enmeshed in this world economy and dependent on the whims of whoever's producing your Caterpillar tracks or whatever? Or are you going to produce it yourself and have freedom and economic freedom and sovereignty and independence from the whims of global geopolitics? So you have these super fragile, super optimized networks where the windshield of your car is made in Honduras, the wiper blades are made in Korea, crap like that. Now, any crises in any of these places means you have to scramble in order for your cars to have wiper blades or whatever. And because you scrambled and just cobbled together that industry that you had long ago outsourced to Korea, they're not going to be as good. They're going to stink. They're going to come late. So your cars are going to come late, right? And everything's going to be affected by that. Right? Businesses that need cars to do stuff, like businesses use cars all the time, their orders are going to be late. And so every stupid little thing that happens in any country is now going to affect all of your chains of production. But here's another thing to consider, which is that comparative advantage itself changes. Going back to the Japanese car industry, if in 1945 you just had global free trade, there would likely be no Japanese car industry. There would be American car companies with plants in Japan, but no Japanese car industries. Japan would be filled by American companies with Japanese middle managers. But by protecting their industries, now when you let down the gates, suddenly Japan has similar efficiencies to U.S. car companies. Better in some ways, worse in others. And so who has a comparative advantage in what is largely a function of what industries get protected by the state, right? It's a function of trade and industrial policy. So comparative advantage is not, this uniform state. It's constantly in flux, and protectionism can change that flux. And the last thing to consider is the race to the bottom. To speak in rather gross terms, the rise in standard of living is a result of increase in the ratio of capital to labor. Now, I know capital is not homogeneous. I'm not making that claim. I'm speaking very at sort of a high level. That's what happens. Because when you have more capital relative to labor, that means more production for any given worker. When you increase the labor supply, either through immigration or outsourcing, you are turning back the clock on economic development. When you have free trade with Mexico, Now suddenly this unified economy, this US-Mexico, this Amero economy, has a lot more people, but not so much more capital. And the push will be to equalize wages with Mexico. Not entirely because of inherent differences between the people there, but we don't need to go that deep into that here. Mexican wages go up, American wages go down, so in a sense you're time traveling. You're turning back to the clock on industrial development. And this has quality of life considerations. Say you want a nice country with lots of worker protections, social safety nets, medical and dental coverage for everyone, pensions. I'm a real big fan of pensions, all right? But that's another topic for another time. These are things that labor movements fought for. And they fought for, too, in a roundabout way, establish worker control of the means of production, right? More and more of what is produced is going to the workers, less into other capital investment, and workers are now more in charge of what's being made. This is the evolution of healthy capitalism, okay? As much as unions may not like that, a lot of unions may think of themselves as socialists or whatever, really they are, the late stages of healthy capitalism. This is where capital becomes so abundant, but labor doesn't, that labor can start beginning to bargain for all sorts of goodies. And unions are just a manifestation of this reality. This is the way in which standards of living rise. Or this is a way in which standards of living rise, right? Union-derived benefits. That's just one manifestation of that. But with free trade, the unions are dead because labor doesn't have the bargaining power it used to. And so the U.S. is going back in time to early capitalism because that's where all these brown countries are. And always kind of will be, okay? And so what they function as is just an infinite capital sink that allows, these people to relive the good old days of the insane profits of early industrialization when labor couldn't do squat because brown populations will grow until literally the planet can't feed them, and they don't develop anywhere near the amount of competing capital that white populations do. Now, I and people like Bill Gates and other, wealthy capitalists know that this is because of genetic differences, right? While the masses deny it. So it's weird, this sort of this elite mass, like basically the elite, they're all hereditarians and race realists for the most part, whereas the masses are egalitarians. But whatever you think the reasons are, the reality is that these people don't develop a middle class for whatever reasons. They don't develop competing capital within India, for example, to anywhere near the ratio you get in white countries. Yes, there are rich Indian businessmen, but India's GDP is roughly that of the United Kingdom, despite having a population about 25 times the size. That's why they love outsourcing to the brown world. Less capital, more labor, higher profits, drive wages down, and they can be the robber barons forever. And okay, to the lowbirds here, robber baron is a figure of speech. I know that was overstated at the time. Okay, in fact, if you know my history, I know that better than anyone. I'm just using that as a figure of speech, right? People know what it means. But all this stuff, all that outsourcing of capital, it's not for your benefit. It's them wanting to relive the conditions of early capitalism to when labor couldn't bargain for squat, and they want to drive you down to that level. And so if you're free trading and you want nice things like, higher wages, the 6-hour day, universal medical and dental coverage, you're going to have to compete with countries that don't mandate such things from the state and whose labor can't bargain for such things from the companies. And that's why free trade is often referred to as a race to the bottom. And so with this COVID crap, not only do you have the long burn incurring damage done by free trade and outsourcing, now you have some bat virus from China affecting your life. This wasn't the case in the past. Oh, something's happening in China? Oh, well, now you can't work. All right? Back then, people would say, what does that have to do with the price of tea in China? Because the price of tea in China didn't matter because it was over there. right? And it was, first off, it was a smaller economy, but more importantly, it wasn't connected. It was there. We weren't connected to them, and so China's problems weren't our problems. We're connected to China, so now China's problems are our problems. So as it happened this time, it's a virus. Okay, but it was something, say it was a famine, or say it was some political revolution in China, or say China decided to invade South Korea. Well, China, produces 80% of our medicine? I'm not sure how they weight each medicine, but broadly and grossly, we'll go with 80% of quote-unquote medicine. Fine. But why? Why would the U.S. allow this? Right? Who are the idiots that allowed this to happen? And why did they... well, they did it because it's cheaper to make it in China. So if the U.S., for example, were to have to go to war with China... Well, now we're going to have to cobble 80% of our medicine production, right? Like, instantaneously. The whole system is so fragile. And for what? For what? So that, the real wages can go down since the 1970s? So that, we can't continue to reduce the hours we have to work in a day? Went from 12 hour to 10 hour to 8 hour. We should be going to 6 hour. But if anything, it's going up from 8 hours. If anything, people are working more than 8 hour days now, right? For what? So they can go into more debt? So they have to pay more for dental and medical? So that they can't have pensions, right? Irrespective of how I feel about pensions, for not being able to get a job out of high school that can comfortably support a family of 5. Nobody would have made this deal if it were up to a vote. And on top of all that, all the stuff we use is produced in manufacturers scattered across the 4 winds all around the globe, and any stupid little political revolution in Latin America this week means that tractor production is down 80% because our O-wings are made in Honduras or whatever. Right? The truth is, the United States does not need to trade in any manufactured goods. Now, you may find a few instances here and there where the foreign production efficiencies are so great that it's worth not having our own industry in that. If they're like, if they can produce it at 10% of the cost of it being produced in the U.S., then okay, maybe that's an instance where free trade would be better. But even then, I'm a skeptical Sam, because if you start producing it in the U.S., the U.S. gets more efficient at producing it, and there's path development and non-dependence on foreign states. So as a general rule, I mean, maybe the devil's in the details, but as a general rule, the U.S. needs to not be importing any manufactured goods if it can. And the U.S. can manufacture everything it needs. And it won't be globally competitive. Fine, raise the tariffs. That means tariffs get raised on you in response. Okay, but that's fine, because we don't want to play that game. Who the hell wants to play that game? The only thing the U.S. needs to be importing are natural resources, a few ag products that can't be produced in the U.S. at all, and maybe the occasional manufacturing thing where the gains from trade are, 90% or something. Otherwise, the benefits will almost never outweigh the costs, even in the short run. And in the long run, it reduces our economic capabilities and paths to development, and it prevents us from having all the nice things that the unions fought for, because we're stuck in a race to the bottom with Burma and Bolivia, and we're dependent on, the goings-on and geopolitical nonsense. And the whole COVID situation, this is just highlighting the nonsense of global trade, of global free trade. It highlights the fragility of this and the stupidity of not being in control of your economy and just blowing it out to the 4 winds.